am I losing my puncher capabilities as I do all this sweet spot and threshold work? Or will it come back when I finally enter the specialty phase? How should I go about finding my rider type? So the core part of this question, before we go about answering like how should he find his rider type, but this is the really common one that we find. People wonder if steady state work hurts their short power, right, Chad? That's like the question that we hear. And if you focus
Yeah.
on one, the other one falls off, is the assumption.
Yeah, and probably just temporarily. I mean, if anything, he's laying a wider base, a greater foundation, a stronger foundation for better anaerobic work down the line. Because anything you do that enforces that aerobic foundation will later reinforce what you can do anaerobically. And I do recognize that there is a trade-off. If you focus strictly on anaerobic, it's going to come at some expense to your aerobic system and vice versa. But I don't think that's really what we're talking about here. Right now, you got a temporary shift trying to grow your muscle endurance because you assume you're not good at efforts longer than, the 400 or the mile. Well, first question is, did you ever train for distances that were longer than the 400 or the mile? Because you got to put in the work. You may not be naturally good at those things, but it doesn't mean you can't get good at those things. Yeah, there's a genetic predisposition. It just so happens that maybe the next question or a question in this week's podcast has to do with genetics. So I'm going to table that for now, but don't get too hung up on these so-called genetic limitations. In your case, maybe you do have a genetic predisposition towards high anaerobic capacity, anaerobic power, and that just means that it's going to come back that much easier when you do decide to focus on it again. So now you're just elevating one aspect of your fitness, and it's a very important one. And then when you come back and target those things that you're already good at, you've just got a wider base upon which to build that strength of yours. And then it just know, and if you've listened to the podcast, you've heard this: short power develops and returns quickly. So yeah, it may dissipate quickly, but that means it comes back. That means it comes back quickly. If you don't have it in the first place, you can probably train a decent level of it pretty quickly. And bonus on top of it, if you happen to be detrained, well, I guess in any case, detraining leads to anaerobic adaptations. So I mean, honestly, you could just take a break from the bike for a little while and it would shift things a little more anaerobically. If for whatever reason you need to maintain this anaerobic capacity, maybe it's important right now, maybe you're racing through a training block sort of thing, you can always touch up that system. And this is another thing we've hit on many times. It doesn't take a heck of a lot. So maybe you have a very sweet spot or muscle endurance focused block. Maybe whatever phase you're in, there's nothing to say you can't sprinkle in, and it doesn't even have to be a dedicated workout, but a bit of anaerobic work. I mean, you can just add a couple anaerobic efforts to a sweet spot workout, maybe toward the tail end, or you can do a very short anaerobic workout and probably see to it that none of your anaerobic capacity and power diminish at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, to your point about having come from a different sport and you're kind of mapping your strengths and weaknesses from another sport onto cycling. I did the same thing when I first started cycling, and boy, was I wrong. So as most of you probably know, I was a swimmer before I was a cyclist, and my swimming strengths were mostly mid to long distance. I wasn't a long distance, but I was sort of 200, 400 meter swimmer. And I really, as a swimmer, I didn't have much of a sprint. Like I would say that I couldn't really sprint to save my life. And so when I started cycling, this is really, really early on before I really started to understand tactics too. Like in my very first collegiate cycling races, I would end up in a break of 4 and I wouldn't even contest the sprint at the finish. And I remember after watching me like not contest the sprint at the finish of a race at one point, one of my teammates was like, "Why didn't you sprint?" And I just shrugged and said, "Well, I've never been able to sprint as a swimmer. Like I can't sprint." And she kind of looked at me like, "Have you ever tried?" And I was so utterly convinced until she said that. And then I realized just in that moment, like how ridiculous it was that I was making this assumption, having not even tried. So anyway, the next day, I think this was like one of those collegiate weekends where you have 3 races on 3 days in a row. And so the very next day I was in another race and I was in a break and I contested the sprint that time. And I actually came in second and really surprised myself. I didn't expect that I would be able to do that. So just, don't paint yourself into a corner with this before you really, to Chad's point, before you've really actually tried to train some of these other strengths or weaknesses, you might surprise yourself. I would even venture to say that a sprint is probably one of the most trainable skills, not just because an effective sprint isn't just about raw power. I mean, that certainly helps, but it's also about how quickly you can accelerate And a lot of that has to do with just neuromuscular speed and recruitment. It's not necessarily like you might not get up to the highest speed or the highest wattage, but if your rate of acceleration is higher than others around you, boy, is that an advantage. And a lot of that is just training leg speed. Successful sprints and attacks are really tactical. So it's all in the position, the timing, and the acceleration. It's not necessarily going to be, again, about that peak power output. So all of these things are things that you can train. And to Chad's point, training that neuromuscular speed and recruitment, sometimes that's just as simple as doing some really high cadence work at very low resistance. And that doesn't take that's not taxing because you're not putting out a lot of power. So, ignore your power and just see how fast you can get your cadence from like 80 to 150, 160, 180. See if you can even hit 200. I mean, why not? But that kind of neuromuscular recruitment and motor pattern training can give you a really nice acceleration, regardless of power output. So I wouldn't, don't paint yourself into a corner. Don't make assumptions until you've tried it. Just train it and see what happens.
If you like this video, you should subscribe to our channel. Maybe even give this video a like with a thumbs up and a comment down below.
If you want to see race analysis videos, you can click on it right over here. And if you want to get your coaching questions answered, you can click on it right over here.
And if you want to become a faster cyclist, which you should go over to TrainerRoad.com. It'll make you faster. We promise. We guarantee it, right, Nate?
Guaranteed. Or your money back.
Yes, it's true, actually. We really will do that.
Yeah.